to see if that bass thing is a microphone issue. Hold on.
Okay, this is the presenter mic, and it's just from what I hear in the room, it sounds much less bass than the other one, and I'm going to go to the floor mic. This is the floor mic, and how does this sound compared with the other two? Okay, so I gather from the comments that we should probably have the chairs use the presenter mic whenever we can, and we'll just use the chair mic if we have to interrupt the presenter or something. So I have grabbed the presenter mic. Let's get this one out of the way. Okay. And my co-chair has just returned with his adapter. We're about to see Curry Tandor on the screen, I think. So while he's setting up for projecting things, I will welcome everybody to the JMAP working group, which is in Barcelona. The back part over there, which is Athens, is not going to be used. Everybody come up to Barcelona, please. Unless you're just here to read your email, in which case you can hang out in Athens if you like. We appear to have a lot of people remote this time, so please be careful to use the microphone if you say anything. Don't have side conversations. And please identify yourself before you speak into the microphone, or as you speak into the microphone, since before wouldn't really help. So let's flip over to the next slide here. Okay, there's our little thing. Blue sheets. No, Alexei, kill that. I just want to use one blue sheet, and there's a blue sheet. There's already one going around. So we have a blue sheet going around. Everyone please sign it. The note well is here, and you should note the note well, as I am well known to note. Basically, the note well says there are IPR things that IPR policies you ought to be aware of. Look them up if you don't understand them. So today we're going to talk about JMAP mail for a bit, and then the JMAP core document for a bit, and then hit any other business we might have. We have quite a bit of time allocated to those first two, and I expect we will spend it. Is there anything in particular that someone would like added to the agenda that we have not heard about? Hearing nothing, we'll move to the next slide, and I guess I'll let my co-chair give the background.
I just wanted to quickly go over why JMAP. These are the slides we used at the last meeting as well, and we're still trying to do the same thing, basically, trying to come up with a protocol that will replace IMAP, particularly for constrained network environments, for mobile platforms, and for slow networks, so something that works well with latency. At the moment, it's really hard to write a good client, and you see a lot of people who say, I'm going to write an IMAP client, and then spend the first 6 months just writing the protocol support before they even get on to building their client. And so some JSON over HTTP protocols have been appearing either within particular companies or as an attempt to provide API as a service. So you subscribe to someone's API that then wraps mail rather than having to do mail directly. I would consider it a failure of the JMAP protocol if we're in a position where people start selling a easy adapter over the top of JMAP to allow people who can't cope with the complexity of JMAP to write an email client. So one of our goals is to make it easy for people who aren't the best developers in the world, who aren't mail experts, to still interact with email without having to learn everything up front. So according to our charter, we wanted to specify a single efficient protocol that allows a client to connect to a server and communicate over the one protocol for everything that it needs. Yes? Good question. That was...
So, yeah, I forgot to re-ask that. I'm not asking for a JabberScribe. I don't think we need one. What I'm asking for, I will channel people from remote if they can't use MeetEcho. What I am asking for is somebody to take notes for minutes, and by that I mean note this topic was discussed. This was the resolution. Or action items. Yeah, that's really all I want from this. Not a lot of burden here, but we do need someone to do it. And, Chris, thank you very much. Chris Newman has agreed.
All right, back to where we were. So we wanted specifically to address the mobile environment. Mobile clients are a big growth area at the moment, and they're not well served by IMAP and SMTP, particularly since they lose network more frequently than something that's sitting on your desk with a cable plugged into it. We wanted to maintain compatibility with existing data models, specifically IMAP, to allow servers to have a way to upgrade from what they do now to JMAP without having to rewrite everything and run two completely separate infrastructures. And we specifically said we're not trying to solve server-to-server encryption and SMTP on port 25. That's a whole basket of worms we do not want to dive into. So that's specifically out of scope for this. Roughly, this is a slide that we had last time, exactly the same. Goals for JMAP are to use the network efficiently, to be easy to implement, and to be compatible with IMAP data models. There are some small points there. You can read them in your own time. These slides are all uploaded. We're now on page 8, JMAP mail, and let's hand over to Neil.
Okay, hi everybody. I'll just hold this. So this is an area that has changed since Chicago. So I'm just going to go over what we discussed on the mailing list, what we agreed. Essentially, it's adding support for the full for IMAP keywords. So we previously just had support for the system flags. This adds support for accessing any IMAP keywords. The specification explicitly says we're sharing the registry with IMAP keywords so that undefined in one place is available in both IMAP and also in JMAP, which will provide, again, part of the compatibility and upgrade path, and for server being able to support someone using both an IMAP and JMAP client to view the same mail store will get a consistent view of their data. The only thing that we've kind of changed is the system flags in IMAP were originally demarked with a leading backslash. This was never then added to, and all future keywords, including important kind of system level ones that were registered, used a $, prefix, and so you end up with this very weird mix of $, and backslash. Since backslash is a real pain in, well, a lot of languages because it's an escaping character, and also it's really inconsistent, we're going to map the backslash scene backslash. There's 4 system keywords we have there. Those will get mapped to $ scene, answered, etc., which makes it much more consistent. Other than that, can we move to the next slide? Here's a quick example of what that looks like. Basically, on the message object, you now have a keywords property. Because there's no kind of map type in JSON, it's the key of the object is the keyword, and then it always maps to true. So this message has the scene, the answered, system flags, and also a custom flag, which is just custom. And this replaces the previous properties we had, which were is unread, is drop, which were Boolean properties, but just for the specific system ones. So that's basically the change that's been discussed and agreed now in the spec, I believe. Does anyone have any comments or questions or further points on that before we move on? Absence would be false, yes. This is the set of keywords that apply. Anything not there, it does not exist on the message.
It's identical to flag in IMAP. So flag, fetch flag on a particular message, you get a list of the things that
Okay, great.
we have one action item.
Yes, there's one action item which is to register the $4 system flags in the IANA registry. Just to note that you can't use these in IMAP to mean something different to the backslash versions in IMAP, because that would be insane. Yes.
I guess I should use this. Jeff Sipek, DevCut. always true? So why isn't it not a list?
It's not a list because two reasons. Firstly, a list is ordered, and so you can have some weird inconsistencies. But more importantly, it's much easier to patch a keyword. So we haven't got the syntax for this yet, but plan to add it in core. A way of basically saying, add this keyword by patching the object, or remove this keyword. Whereas if it's a list, you can do it by index, but then you have the whole ordering problem. It's a lot harder. So basically that's why it's like this.
This is Barry. The on the registry, you've got to register every keyword that's in there with a backslash. You have to register with a $sign.
Yes.
And every future thing that gets registered with a backslash has to be registered with a $sign as well.
So far, there has never been anything. In fact, I don't think you could register something that a backslash because that is reserved.
Backslash is reserved for standards action. You have to update the IMAP spec.
Sure, but
so you can't register a new backslash flag. You have to update so it has to be a spec update that goes through the ISG. So
that means that somebody needs to remember that if a backslash one is added by a future standard, that the $sign version has to also be reserved.
I think we agree, but we also think this will never happen.
Yeah, I agree.
Sure.
All right.
Great. Okay, so I think that's settled. Everyone seems reasonably happy, so let's move on to the next slide. I don't know. There is a GitHub issue, I guess.
We can talk afterwards. I'll tell you how to write the INO considerations.
Great.
It's easy.
Action. Use this one. Okay.
Oh, sorry, my bad. I'm Chris Newman for the people who are remote.
Yes. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? Okay. So this is another area that there's been quite a lot of discussion on the mailing list since the last conference. And there have been quite a lot of changes. I think we're very close to a consensus now on what to do here. This is about sending mail submission. One of the core requirements for JMAP was that you don't need a second protocol in order to send as well as receive, because that creates all sorts of support nightmares that if you've ever run an email service, you've probably seen. So the new plan is, the previous plan was to have an outbox mailbox that you would move messages to. The new plan gives a lot more control and ties itself a lot more into SMTP so that you can use a lot more of the available features in SMTP without us having to redefine lots of new mappings. We basically define a new object type called the message submission object, which I'll show you in a sec what that looks like. Creating one of these, it has a reference to the message you're sending, so reference to the message data, but lets you specify the SMTP envelope, so you can specify who it's sending to and stuff. But also it gives you the option of of omitting that and just having it pull that data in from the two CC BCC fields if you're doing simple mail sending stuff to make it easier for clients too. The other main points about this is the message submission object ends up basically as a log of email that you've sent, and we can also update, or the server can update the object with delivery status of the message as it gets sent through the system. So this gives you a lot more capability than before to then, if you're writing a client, be able to not just send a message, but then to pull up that message submission object later and go, what happened to this message? Did I get an error from some of these responses? So this provides a lot of extra flexibility whilst building on the existing RFC standards. So I think, as I said, we're pretty close to something that everyone seems to be happy with so far on the mailing list. So if we just move to the next slide, this might be a little bit small. That's not too bad. This gives you a bit of an idea of what a message submission object looks like. There's a reference. The message ID reference is the most important one. That's your JMAP message ID, not necessarily the same as an RFC 5322 message ID if you're new to JMAP. And that's just a reference to the other object to say this is the message data that we're sending. That represents your 5322 message. JMAP has identity objects, which you reference one of those to say, who am I sending this as? I'd say see the identity spec if you're not sure about what that's about, but this can be quite important for the server to be able to apply some policy and check you're allowed to send that message. The thread ID is just the thread ID that's associated with the message or the message ID. The server sets that to make it easier for the client to query these things later. Then we've got the important bits, which is basically the envelope. This will change slightly still, so we can add attributes, but is essentially the data you need from SMTP, for the mail from and the receipt to. Maybe can unsend. So this is one of the more interesting properties is for systems that can support undo send, or if they support delayed send and you've delayed the send of the message, this property can be true. And then the client will have some mechanism of saying, updating the message submission object to say actually cancel this send. And if that's possible, then that will succeed. It's always it's the reason the attribute's commonly called maybe can unsend is that you can never really guarantee that this is gonna work. And then here we can see a delivery status object. This starts as null, but after the server starts sending it, the server can update this. It's not a must because it would make it very hard to build simple proxies to SMTP, but we're hoping in the future servers that will implement this and update this with the status of messages to show what happened to them after you've sent them, which will make it possible for clients to much more easily show users the status of their sent messages. So that's the general proposal for message submission. So I'm going to pause there to see if anyone has comments or questions or other things to say about that.
Chris Newman, I just want to say I have an open issue that I'm going to provide a suggestion on delivery status and disposition status that's more closely aligned with our current specs in that area.
Yeah, thanks for that.
But, similar idea to what you have here, just slightly different
this is
structure. Yeah, basically I want to make the, describe a clean mapping from the existing standards.
Yeah, there will still be a few changes, but I think the general outline seems to be something that everyone's reasonably happy with now. So,
yes, pushing this button makes a big difference. Okay. The fact that when I touched the mic without pushing that button, it made a lot of noise, made me think that I didn't need to push the button. But I think the people remotely will hear my sepulchral voice better now. Dave is on Meet Echo, so I'm going to enable him with the big red button. Dave?
Does this work?
It does.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. Okay. So this is a really small point that isn't a really small point. The naming of message ID, and I apologize for not being into the spec deeply enough to know the answer to this, but I believe you said that it is not ERC 5322 message ID. I therefore invite you to not make it be the same name so that there will be less opportunity for confusion. You'll get enough of that anyhow.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, that's a good point. It's slightly tricky at the moment. We're very consistent of there's an object type and message is the object type. And whenever we reference an ID, we want to use that type name plus the words ID. So I guess one solution is to change object type name in JMAP from message to something else. I'm not sure if we can come up with something suitable. But yeah, I agree that is likely to cause confusion. So we should try and find some way of avoiding that confusion if we can.
John Dowdle from Airbus. This is my first time in this group, so forgive me if this question's been answered aeons ago. I'm old enough to remember the days when mail wasn't abused by spammers and so forth, and nobody seems to send delivery reports and things these days for fear of triggering spam pots. Have you? When you were thinking this up, did you think, well, should we actually try and do it a different way and then discarded that and came up with this? Or what was your...
Specifically to do with delivery notifications?
Yeah, trying to do it in some way which... I know there's lots more safeguards around who the hell's sending this email anyway now. But just a philosophical question there.
Yes, the who is sending is tied to the identity ID thing. But the the delivery status stuff, it's more just about exposing the information that we get to clients in an accessible way. It's not certainly no guarantee that you'll be able to get information beyond the stuff here. You should be able to get. This is the final status code it got before it left your system. But delivery status things beyond that, yes, it would depend. If it's internal mail, then maybe you'll always get them. But if it's external, perhaps it won't. So I think exposing that is important. Hopefully it's exposed in a way that perhaps in the future, yes, you can add other mechanisms that might be more suitable to today. The way we're seeing most new systems do this is with web bugs essentially bypassing the SMT bit altogether. Just put an image into the email, and if people actually load the images, then you say, yep, they've read it. You could integrate that in some way as well. I think we're still working on this, as Chris mentioned, still proposals on how this is going to be represented, and certainly it should be open to be extensible in the future. But there's value right now, I think, in exposing information that we currently have from protocols that are already there and in use.
Yeah, Chris Newman, just a suggestion on Dave's comment, maybe J message ID.
Yeah, I think we need to come up with a object type name, because we don't want to make that the one inconsistent one where you reference that by a different name plus ID,
right?
But it's still called message.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, I agree with the naming concern.
It's unfortunate, but yes, it is confusing. So I see if we can kind of find a synonym.
Dave, go ahead.
So just following up on that even a bit further, and I typed this into Jabber also, what's occurring to me is that you've got three sources of naming, 5322, 5321, and JMAP, and they're co-occurring within this single environment. And you may want some meta conventions for that so that you just don't have to worry about particular cases colliding.
Well, or how about, this is Barry, how about having an object called ID, and the members of the object are identity colon whatever, message colon whatever, thread colon whatever. Instead of having identity ID, message ID, thread
no,
ID.
This is no, that I don't think that would work in this case. So the ID is, there's always an ID property on any object, and that's the ID of that particular object. The rest of those are foreign keys, if you like, they're external references. And so they certainly shouldn't be lumped in with the ID of the first thing.
Okay, so change my suggestion a little bit, but the point is have all of those other external ID things grouped into one object, rather than having them be a bunch of separate elements.
I don't think that's the best solution, because generally we make everything as much as possible key value on the top level to make it, I think it's easier to track changes and to submit just patches of things that you want. But I think, well, we can see if there's any more suggestions now, but I think we can take this to the list and find a solution to this problem.
Another difficulty with that suggestion is that there are places where these IDs are used more deeply within structures, where there's a list of IDs being returned or a list of structured IDs being returned, where having another level of indirection would really complicate the object a lot.
Yeah, I think we'll find another name for message in some way.
All right, and let's move on.
That'll work. Okay, next slide then, please. I think we know what's left to do, and there were no big objections to it, but yes, any final comments on message submission? Good. Okay, so the final topic we wanted to talk about a bit today in the mail section. So this is the representation in JSON of the RFC 5322 message. And kind of related to that, being able to fetch just part of a body. So if you have a text body that's multi-megabytes long, allowing client to just fetch maybe the first 100 kilobytes of it, display that, and then if the user really wants it, explicitly go back and fetch the rest of it. In general, in JMAP, we've been very careful to make sure that the client can never get flooded with data. It always is control of how much data within rough bounds it will get back from the server in response to a request. This is one area where it doesn't know how big the body is, and it could ask for a body and get back 50 megabytes of data over the connection. That's not great, especially if you're on a slow mobile connection. That could lock up your whole client if it doesn't know how to cancel that and try and do something else. So this is something where we haven't actually got a proposal yet. It's more at the kind of open for ideas stage. The other point of it is the structure we have at the moment representing the message hides pretty much all the complexities of MIME and represents the message in a simple body, which could be text body or HTML body or both if there's both representations, plus attachments, and pretty much everything else is represented as an attachment. And it provides the functionality that that most email clients need, from what I can see, whilst making it much easier for them to work with it. However, sorry. If you want more than that, at the moment, your only other option is to fetch the raw 5322 message and pass it yourself and do everything yourself, which is an option in JMAP, but there's kind of no in-between stage. So I think one of the open questions is whether that's a sufficient representation in JSON. If not, what else should be there? How can we potentially add more options without making it ridiculously complex, and also making sure that clients that do the things that most clients do don't have to deal with all this complexity still. They can still use this more simple representation. So I think this is more kind of open question and something we'll be looking at on the mailing list over the next few weeks, few months. But I wanted to bring it up now to see if anyone had particular ideas, comments, or suggestions on this area.
Chris Newman, the one, I haven't thought it all the way through yet, but the one sort of starting point for the structure problem is, so we have this attachment list in the JMAP structure. If we put, so IMAP has a dotted numeric string that says where in the MIME structure this part appears. That's something that's defined in IMAP. If you added that data item to the attachment list, clients can ignore it if they don't care about it, but it gives clients that do care about the MIME structure that additional information about the structure. So that might get us part of the way to more cleaner semantic mapping. And you might be able to, from those numbers, figure out, drop a number and fetch that or something like that. So I think that might be a road to walk down. That's not too big a change. And I know the suggestion for partial body fetch that I had heard was HTTP range, which in order to make that work, you'd need to know offsets to the parts as well.
Yeah, I don't know that's going to be the... Well, all the attachments already get a blob ID, and you can get a URL that represents those. And obviously, you could then do a partial range fetch on that. But for the actual just text body and HTML body, I think we want some way of just being able to return a truncated version within the JSON structure within a batch call still. So I don't think that HTTP range is going to be a complete solution for that.
Okay, I got it. Thanks.
Okay, any further comments on message structure?
We expected to spend quite a lot longer on this part when we put this
without a
together.
proposal, it's always going to...
Yeah, but it's certainly, this is going to be one of the interesting bits that we need to spend a while on, both in terms of working out the mapping even for what we have now and how to get there. If you have a multi-part mix that has some text and then an image and then some more text and then another image, what does that look like over JMAP? Thankfully, it's immutable, so at least you don't have to round trip back from that. It's only a one-way conversion, but that's worth, I think, everyone who's interested in this thinking about how that should look. One specific thing on this slide here is we don't want to end up with the situation that JCal has, which is that you take the structure of a vCard and you map that to a JSON structure, which is exactly the same and is just a bunch of lists that
no
It's
one
just
wants
a
to use
parser.
it as dead on
Yeah,
arrival.
yeah.
And it
You might
was-
as well just parse.
Yeah, I have a feeling that we're not going to know exactly whether we have it right until we get some implementations playing with it back and forth. So,
the current version we have used in production and works quite nicely. But
but
certainly,
other message stores will have other needs, and
yes,
you know, we
it
may
does it offer the
find
flexibility
Right.
for the use cases that we need. Yeah, that did remind me of one more point I wanted to make about this. The current specification is quite underspecified on terms of how you map from MIME to this, and certainly needs more recommendations. What I'm not convinced of, and I'd be interested to hear other opinions on this, is that it should mandate an exact algorithm of how you convert from all situations in MIME to HTML text, because there are a lot of weird, possibly invalid versions that you see in the real world, and that people end up having to adapt to and do different things to, and giving them the flexibility of saying, here's how we recommend you convert, but not this is how you must do it, should not cause incompatibility, because the client doesn't have to care how it's converted, just gets the data from the server and renders it, but gives you the flexibility then in the future to fix this with changes to the algorithm.
Okay, Dave, go ahead.
So a synonym for flexibility is non-interoperability. To the extent that it is possible to reasonably define an algorithm that does the mapping between the two forms, it will increase interoperability a lot. It's usually a pain to do that kind of mapping, to do that kind of definition. Long run benefit usually is pretty high.
Chris Newman, I think a comment somewhat along similar lines is I think it's important to define a baseline, like the minimum set of character sets, the minimum, some minimum set of things you do. And so that gets you closer to interoperability. But, with respect, why I think we do need a little wiggle room is because JMAP is actually quite a bit closer to the UI than IMAP. And so in order to get the easy, good UI, we actually do need to allow some wiggle room to make improvements and in the conversion. So, if there's some broken mail format, if you need to clean it up so it works in the UI, you should clean it up so it works in the UI.
A particular example that you run into a lot when you're getting email from all over the internet is the char set field that comes in on MIME parts can be all sorts of crazy broken. I get a lot of char set equals something. It's a really basic case, but there's all sorts of weird stuff winds up in there that it looks like someone's just typed a random bunch of text.
And I think just as kind of a related area, just on the idea of not necessarily always specifying everything and it's being better, is search. So in IMAP, search is very explicitly substring based, and as such is basically impossible to implement in a performant way and be compliant with the spec. So that's why, you get things like Gmail just ignores the spec because it would be useless, or you have various other options. It's a mess. Whereas with JMAP, what we've done is say, this is how you should interpret the filter, but we're not going to tell you how to stem. We're not going to tell you exactly how you should match, what your algorithm should be for matching the text against this. It's more, this is how you should interpret the intent and give us back results. And I think that's the only way that otherwise you wouldn't have conform implementations, because Gmail are not going to change their stemming algorithm, their search indexing to match whatever you specified. Similarly, there's lots of other complex implementations, but it doesn't matter for interoperability because you're still getting what the user wants conveyed to the server, and the server is returning results that matches in the best way it can match.
Yeah, Alexei Melnikov, maybe not a great example, but sometimes if you're searching for text, that's probably, it's better to be flexible and allow servers to, experiment, where if you're searching for date or a range of dates,
yes,
you want to do, prescribe the algorithm.
That is how it is defined in JMAP, yes.
Exactly.
It's just text that's flexible. Dates, it tells you exactly what you're meant to be doing. That. Yes, sorry, I should have made that clear. I was trying to, yes, just use that as an example of where I think you want to specify enough to be interoperable, but not necessarily the fine detail because that restricts things too much. Okay, let's move on. So now we're moving over to JMAP. So this is independent of mail, and so one of the main things that we just defined.
Actually, wait, then before we get there,
Yes.
This is Barry. I want to go back to keywords for a moment and the registration.
Okay.
Do we want to block future registrations of $ keywords that don't come from JMAP?
No, we don't want to block that.
No, we want $ keywords to work in both JMAP and IMAP. So
Yes.
you actually change the registry to say this applies to both protocols.
Yeah. Something like dollar fishing,
Yeah,
which is currently being proposed.
Yep.
It has been, it's already in
But
there.
it's not, yep.
Move on.
Yep.
Thanks.
So- Okay. So, extensions. Over time, we will obviously want to add further data types you can access over JMAP. We'll want to add potentially extra properties to objects that exist in previous specs, potentially even change semantics of certain methods. And of course, if you have proprietary services are probably going to want to add on custom things which don't make sense necessarily to standardize, but you want to expose that over JMAP as well. So we need to come up with a flexible way of allowing for extensions in the future that's not going to result in chaos with this. So the current vague proposal, and we haven't written this up yet, but is basically when you make an API request, with the set of method calls you're making, you'll pass it a using, and that gives you, and that's a property with a list of named extensions. And you can have vendor extensions in there, which must be namespaced under a domain that the vendor owns to make sure it doesn't clash. There's no x- prefixes anywhere in the thing. Once you've opted into the extension, that's what you do. That means that then applies. But if you don't opt in, then it must conform with the base specification without the extension, must behave without the extension. If there are extensions that are not compatible with each other, then the server needs to reject it if the client tries to ask for both to be used at the same time. And then the server advertises which extensions it can support in some way. That's the base idea. The bit at the bottom, using JMAP mail, is the idea that even mail itself, that is an extension that's saying, I want to use mail over JMAP. And you would have to use that to get there.
Alexei, I haven't thought this through yet, but in IMAP there is enable extension that might have some effect. It might solicit the server to send information in different format or extra information. So what you just said, I think, will prohibit this sort of thing. Is it?
Sorry, I wasn't quite clear on that. Could you?
With IMAP enable extension,
Yep.
you can enable extensions that will tell the server to send information in different way or extra information.
Yes.
So that the client is capable of understanding some extra stuff.
Yes.
Um,
So this would also allow that. You would be using.
I think
whatever
I've heard you just said, it will, you have to be backward compatible with the base spec. Yeah.
If the client doesn't opt in.
Okay.
If the client doesn't
Sorry,
opt into an extension, then the
I
server.
misheard you. Never mind.
Sorry, that was clearly not clear enough. Yeah, if the client doesn't opt in, the server must behave as though the extension was not there. It can't just give the client data it's not expecting. But yes, no. Once the client opt in, that extension can change the behavior of JMAP however the extension defines it, basically. Yes. What's the other thing? Oh yeah, and the server will advertise which extensions it supports after you have authenticated, which is quite important because that means that it can give different options to different people, which we found before is useful in the past. Obviously, if it wants to give the same to everyone, that's easy too. But requiring authentication first makes things more flexible there. Any further comments on extensions and how that might work? I fear, without a proposal, it's one of those things where the devil's in the details to a certain extent, but
Alex again. Yeah, I'm not. I know this is a rat hole we're going to fall into later on, but if we want to potentially advertise authentication extensions, ways of authenticate, we need a separate way.
Yeah,
because it needs to be done before authentication, obviously.
I think that will be a separate part. Yeah.
Yeah, Chris Newman, I think the experience I've seen in the IETF is whenever possible, you want extensions that the server announces and the client uses or not as it wishes. But in IMAP, we did find cases where we needed the client to explicitly opt in, and that's what the enable command's for. And so,
yeah, these are all explicitly opt-in is the plan.
Right. So yeah, I think this is needed because we've seen it needed in IMAP, but used sparingly.
Yeah, I think the other interesting question is how to avoid, if possible, the situation with IMAP where the base specification over time becomes essentially useless and you need a very long list of extensions to be a useful protocol, but how you convey that to users in particular of my server supports IMAP, your server supports IMAP, why does this not work as well with yours as it does with mine? Because they're completely different things. They just both happen to support 3501. So profiles, potentially collecting a bundle of extensions over time in and saying JMAP core plus this bundle of extensions equals JMAP 2017, and then you can advertise that something might be a solution. But comments on this?
Yeah, I don't think there is a magic silver bullet for this, because in IMAP there was originally, IMAP 2, IMAP 2bis, IMAP 4, IMAP 4 Rev1. So that was in a way of sort of including some of the widely implemented stuff into the core spec and revising this. So yeah, it can be JMAP 2017, it can be JMAP 2020 or whatever, eventually. So
yeah, unless you get lucky and get it right the first time, there will be extensions and clients will behave differently with different servers. It's just how it works.
Yeah, I think it's a case where we recognize that this is going to happen, and it's about setting things up so that there's the least pain possible in the future, whilst recognizing there'll probably still be some pain.
Okay, Dmitry, Kaufman, Fastmail user for 10 years. So vendor and expensive namespace. So basically I want a vendor registry, like vendor name and then vendor dot extension. Like
no, the
Microsoft
idea of
dot
vendor extensions is just a way of avoiding name clashes. If you prefix it with your control domain, you can use whatever you want, and those are custom extensions. If someone else uses it, here be dragons on them.
So I want to do like Java style, like com.microsoft.hotmail? No.
Probably should be something like that. The exact details we can still work out.
So we're not discussing. Okay.
Sorry?
So no discussion on that yet. Yeah, fine. Okay, so it wasn't prior work. Okay.
No. Sorry, that's just the general idea we're proposing to allow, because there will be proprietary extensions and some sane way of making that coexist and not cause problems down the line. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Okay, let's start getting into the real cans of worms. So, authentication. We have a little bit of a problem here in that we don't believe that there is an existing authentication mechanism that fulfills the requirements that we have for JMAP. There is a specification we have in JMAP which we can separate out into a separate spec. Certainly, if we go forward with this, I think it needs to be a separate spec. It's the general consensus, and does fulfill the requirements. So one option is just to see if we can pursue that as a standardization effort and use that. But if I just move on to the next slide, I'll just talk briefly about what we think are the requirements, and then people can come up and tell us if there's some magical solution that we've missed that's going to do it. So if we could just skip to the next slide. Okay, so first of all, basic auth is out. Like it's basically deprecated. Gmail, various other mail servers do not allow you to use username password directly. Fastmail, we don't let you use your standard password directly. No one wants this. It creates all sorts of security problems, which I hope everyone's aware of. So, okay, that's out. Secondly, it can't require the client author of the mail client to have to manually register with every JMAP server in the world. There's hundreds of thousands, millions of mail servers. just generally something like OAuth, you have to pre-register with the with Google to get your before you can use it, and that clearly does not scale for mail. So it has to be usable without manually registering beforehand. We think it should allow common two-factor authentication to be used. This is something that's become widespread and hopefully be extensible. And it needs to be extensible with further authentication mechanisms as they become available. And also mail is used in quite a few contexts where there isn't necessarily a browser, and we think it would be much better if it didn't require a browser necessarily to perform authentication or even preform. I've just noticed a spelling mistake. Great. So those are the general requirements we think that we have. So first of all, I'm sure there are people here with comments on, do you think those are the right requirements? Is there something that meets them already? Tell us more.
Hi, Mark Nottingham. Yeah, those are very reasonable requirements. I think they're also really reasonable requirements for lots of other applications as well.
Absolutely.
And just, from a matter of practicality, I haven't looked at the charter in a little while. I don't know the time scale of this working group, but you say that you can't just use BASIC, but over TLS, when I configure my IMAP client to talk to Fastmail, loving Fastmail, you give me a token that I put in, and that is used.
You have to get that token through our web interface, right? Which is not a good user experience. Basically, what you should be able to do is log in with your standard username and password and potentially two-factor authentication mechanisms.
Sure.
But then, as the result of that, the client gets the token automatically, and that's a much better user experience.
But it's no worse than IMAP currently.
Well, the thing is with IMAP currently, lots of vendors are turning to, the big vendors that can force it through are turning away from that and adding on proprietary OAuth extensions to IMAP.
Sure.
Which, doesn't scale. So this is clear. It's kind of there in IMAP, but this is a problem space that's not going away.
I agree with you, and I think something new is probably necessary. It would just be a huge, horrible shame if you design something just for JMAP and it's not usable for other stuff as well.
Yes. So as we've said, we definitely, if we're going to go forward with what we have, we're going to split out into a separate spec. I think what's there is actually a really good solution for this criteria. And as you say, that is definitely generally applicable. So should not just be part of JMAP, should be more widely available.
Which means we need to get the right people into that interaction.
Yes. So that's the next question is, who should that go to? Should that still stay as part of JMAP, or should that go to a separate group?
Yeah. And there's a really active effort right now in the W3C to define, to do web authentication for UTF and all the output of the FIDO stuff. And so just so you know, I'm also the liaison from the IETF to the W3C. So this is partially my headache too, is that's all happening on their side of the trench, and we may need to get more involved in that. And maybe we should be anyway, just regardless of this. So split it into a separate document, and then let's just float it around as much as possible and see what happens.
Great. Let's note that as an action point.
Okay, we have Sean Leonard is next. I would like to see TLS mutual authentication, which is already supported by some IMAP clients. Where is it? And can we devolve to another spec that works reliably on that topic? Don't use basic auth. I somewhat disagree with Mark. The key thing is that the user prompt is not username and password, but some kind of token prompt, maybe with challenges or UI elements. And then he goes back and says, user prompt should read protocol elements. Right.
So I think the TLS mutual auth, if I understand correctly what he's referring to, is where you need the client certificate as well. Yes. That's not always possible in all situations, and you have the problem still of generating the certificate and getting it and authenticating. I don't think this is necessarily a general solution. Sorry, Alexei is jumping.
In Acme, there is a work starting on generating certificate for SMIME and for email specific. So that I know you don't want to depend on this, but that's something that might potentially be fixed at some point.
I think a lot of this speaks to the whole fact that authentication is a big issue that needs to be addressed separately. Torsten.
Torsten Lorstedt, Yes Europe. From my perspective, the huge elephant in the room is OAuth, right? And I would like to understand, as a long-standing member of the OAuth working group, why don't you just use OAuth? Because most... Oh, you can give the answer if you want. No.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't an answer from my perspective.
Okay. So the main... So the implementations that we've seen mostly of OAuth so far tend to be not necessarily compatible with each other, tend to require you to register beforehand with the OAuth provider in order to be able to use it from the client, and also requires a browser, which violates at least 3 or 2 of the ones on the requirements here. Is the short answer.
Torsten again. So the fact that Google, for example, has a proprietary extension today,
yes,
is a description of the current situation. It doesn't mean that the situation can't be changed. I mean, what you're proposing in your cost specification is a complete new protocol for authentication for HTTP-based clients, right? So you have a complete message exchange which incorporates OTP, U2F, and all the other stuff, which is quite complicated from my experiences. So the question also is, if you do, you can just answer on my questions instead of just laughing, right? So I mean, having implemented a lot of this IDP crap for several years on my side, I know how complicated it is to really implement multi-factor authentication. And you were up to define a new protocol which will allow or intends to allow a client to authenticate towards the server using multi-factor authentication. So you even haven't included UAF, FIDO2, push notifications to authentication apps and so on. Do you want to consider all of them in your protocol? I mean, the other option is to use OAuth. To answer your question regarding a registration, you can change that. There's a dynamic registration piece in OAuth. So any email client out there can be registered dynamically with the OAuth provider. If you want to make the OAuth server compliant to your specification, go and sit down and write an OAuth profile, right? OAuth is a framework. And if you want, at least me, I would like to contribute to this activity. Instead of saying, oh, OAuth is crap, it doesn't fit our requirements, let's go and do something else. That's not the right way.
Torsten, is it possible for you to do a prototype draft of an OAuth profile that could work?
I'm not really familiar with this solution space. So what I would offer is we can sit down and can somehow draft something else. But from my perspective, what it needs is a discovery, registration, and a definition of scopes. That's it, right? So the rest in the spec, for example, token revocation, there is an RFC. And I happen to be the editor of this RFC. You can just include it.
So can I suggest that rather than try to hash this part out in the room, that Torsten and Neil get together this week and try to come up with something we can discuss on the list afterwards? Okay. Dave, you're next.
So I think this is an interesting list. It looks intelligent to me. It looks appropriate to me. And I think it has all the difficulty that the past few minutes have been demonstrating. The real danger here is that discussion will get dominated by people who have their favorite solution in mind, rather than really trying to deal with the reality that this is a space with multiple approaches. There is no dominant solution. And worse than that, things change over time. All of that says, in all likelihood, the goal of making sure this is not built into JMAP, but has an interface, is the right one. That it doesn't depend on a particular implementation environment like browser is another appropriate requirement. But it also means that this isn't going to have an easy solution. Best I can figure is it needs to define some kind of interface into the environment, and I don't really know what that means in a way that's scalable.
Mark, again, just real quick, and I agree with what Dave's saying. I think this just keeping it as a point of flexibility is what I think we're really looking for here, and separating out into a separate spec gives you that. Is the intent to accommodate both browser clients and non-browser clients? I'm just getting up to speed with this. It is. Okay. Then, yeah, definitely basic is probably not appropriate. I can see why you're avoiding that.
So this is not Sakimura Nomura research. One question and one comment on all of stuff. One question is, I just want to really understand why you don't want to use browser, because if you use browser in the U2F and all those things that W3Cs and Fido working on comes free with it. So if possible, leveraging browser is a good thing, it seems. The other thing is that OAuth doesn't always require each client to be registered, just like Tosan said, so it can be completely dynamically registered, or we can think of something else as well as when it comes to registering. And the point is that what we want at JMAP probably isn't authentication. We want to access to the resource called mail store. And what we want to concentrate here is authorization. And it's probably a good idea to separate authentication out of the picture.
Yeah, I think everyone's very clear that separating it out is the right solution. So we'll certainly be doing that. In terms of, yes, existing solutions, OAuth is clearly the only option that's out there that's an existing solution. So we should see if there's a profile of that seems sensible. That's certainly worth investigating. And the other option is to separate out the spec that we currently have and investigate the possibility of making that as a separate standard. But I think, yeah, everyone's clear that it needs to be flexible. It's not part of the core spec, that it will be a separate thing that will be referenced, and we will find the best solution that we can to go from there.
I just wanted to address one point that you made there, which is all you need to do is authorization. You don't need to authenticate the specific person. One difficulty here is we're not just giving you access to view information, we're also giving you permission to send email on the behalf of somebody. So knowing exactly who is sending the email rather than just that they have right to see the data is important.
Chris Newman, one other point that was raised is, why can't we just require browsers? And the answer to that is there's lots of agents on the internet that submit mail for all sorts of reasons that are automated and don't even necessarily have a user in front of them, voicemail systems, etc. So submit and need to scan some information about the email as well.
Yes.
Alexei, yeah, I think talking about OAuth and trying to see some text would be useful next step. But there are if we're going to separate what you have, I can talk to Kitchen Working Group and see, whether there is any work to be done there, and most likely most of the work is going to be done not in this working group.
Mark, hopefully one last time. Is this still working? Okay. So I'd like to push back ever so gently on the OAuth notion. I don't think we should use it just because it's there, but let's have the discussion. I just don't want there to only be positive thoughts about OAuth here. I was just talking to Richard Barnes, who's the co-chair of the W3C Web Authentication Working Group. And he's pretty sure their plan for HTTP authentication is to use token bind. So token binding. So that's a working group here. So it might be beneficial for you folks to talk to him and those folks here, because that would be the most natural way to do that flow, I think, for that particular.
So that includes getting the initial token. I have to go look at what the working group are working on.
We should talk to him, because I'm not sure about the details of how. But basically, I think it's you insert you authenticate with your second factor. You get a token, and that automatically goes onto the channel and it gets bound to the TLS channel, and then you're authenticated.
Yes.
So
yeah. Okay.
Thorsten again. So token binding won't give you a protocol to obtain access token. It just makes sure you can't leak the tokens and replay it somewhere else. The the question or the statement I would like to make is, instead of, and that was good to learn more about your requirements regarding the different clients you want to support. I would suggest not to state that you don't want to use a browser. Instead, I would like to suggest that you state which kind of clients you want to support. Because for web applications, it's quite natural to use the web browser to do the authorization process. And even for smartphone applications, that's the state of the art. There are tools out there, libraries, Safari View Controller to actually perform authentication, authorization processes that way, which also gives the IDP the mechanism to do risk-based authentication, all the stuff. You don't want to decrypt to put that into your protocol. And if it comes to server-to-server interactions, to voicemail and all the stuff, there are other grant types out there that could be used for that. Have you ever considered to use refresh tokens or the client credential flow for that? I mean, my point is, I would suggest to place this requirement by particular requirements. Which clients do you want to support? And then I think we can find a clever solution.
Keith Moore, the requirement is perfectly stated as it's written.
I think, yes. It's not that it must not use a browser, it's that it doesn't require a browser, is the way it was stated, I think, is what Keith is getting at.
Perfectly stated, modify modulo the typo.
Yes, modulo the typo. Yes. And look, I think the conclusion here is definitely we should look at what a OAuth profile would offer us, and then evaluate whether that matches what we need. Also look at what other working groups are working on, and whatever else we do, definitely separate it out and hopefully not hold up the rest of JMAP spec on this issue, as it is definitely ancillary, and yeah, whatever you use is going to be more widely applicable than just for JMAP, so it should clearly be something separate.
The other option is for JMAP to just say there will be a way that a token is established and you use the token to authenticate.
Well, okay, we already have an action item that Torsten and Neil will work out something that we can start, that will start the discussion on this. So
yes,
let's go from there. All right.
Okay. On to the next can of worms. Great. Okay. Push mechanism. So one of the things that we need to be able to support is an out-of-band push mechanism, so that because you can't hold on open a persistent TCP connection on mobile. It would kill your battery life, and they just don't let you do it on iOS in particular. And we need to be able to push via proprietary systems that are operating on those devices, because that's the only way you can get push things to them. But we'd also like it to be flexible enough for using whatever system that you need to use. In terms of what data is transferred over push, this I think we are reasonably happy with. It's just transferring a state string. It's not transferring any of your actual email data or any other content data. It's just the type name, like message or thread, and the state string, which represents the current state on the server of that type, of the set of objects of that type that you have. One extra thing we do want to add to the data that's pushed is some kind of flag of what triggered this change, so that clients can tell, was it a message delivery that changed the state of the messages, or was it that you changed something in a client somewhere? Because if you're in a particularly battery constrained environment, you might be more interested in waking up the radio if you know there was actual delivery, and you might want to show that message to the user, as opposed to if someone was marked red somewhere, you can probably wait a few minutes before you update necessarily and coalesce that with other changes so you reduce your battery usage. We also need something that works on the web and on desktop. On desktop, ideally, when you can hold open a persistent TCP connection, that's a lot simpler to deal with. You don't have to go via a third party. It should be quicker, more reliable. More reliable, maybe. So basically, at the moment in the spec, we have two mechanisms, therefore, push to support the two different use cases. For the web and desktop, we currently have, say, basically you can make an event source connection, which which is server sent events directly to the JMAP server, which then just pushes stuff down there. That's the same object. The object's the same, whichever connection you use. This is basically a long-held TCP connection. The other option is you basically register a URL callback on the server, and the JMAP server makes a post request to that URL whenever there's a push. And then so if the JMAP version is compatible with RFC 8030 in terms of what it does with the push subscription URL. So if you have a push server, which is up to the client to have its own push server, that you can then use that either with the rest of RFC 8030 to get it back to your UA, or you can use your proprietary APNS, GCM, or whatever other mechanism to make sure that data ends up back at your client. So basically that you have to have your own push server in that situation, but it gives you the flexibility of either using the full standards or of going your own proprietary route, however you need to do it to get that data to your client. So that's the two options. That's the current plan, is to have those two options available. And as Martin's not in the room, does anyone else have actually objections to this, or is it just Martin that objects to those?
Yeah, I was just going to ask that. We'll have to discuss Martin's.
So objections. Martin, I will be Martin and say this is a terrible idea. Both of those are terrible. The first one is terrible. The event source is terrible because you might lose. In various situations, it doesn't work. You can't, and people are moving away from using event source, I think was the summary of what he was saying. In certain situations, the TCP connection might be dropped along the way, various other things like that. To which I would say yes, but we have a mechanism. The server also sends a ping every 5 minutes, so the client can tell if something's gone wrong with the connection on the line and try and reopen it. If it fails every time, then it just can't open a push connection. The other thing is that it does work in a lot of situations, including in current browsers, and it's very easy to implement for any desktop client or anything that can hold open a persistent connection. Mark.
It's Mark Nottingham. So I don't really have strong opinions about event source, but a lot of the folks that I talk to kind of make weird faces when you mention it. They see it as a Mickey Mouse protocol. I think that's a little
Mickey Mouse has endured for a long time.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, and made a lot of money.
Made a lot of money.
Are you using last event ID on it?
Yes.
Okay, good. So you can't lose events in that, at least in those scenarios. The strongest kind of argument that I heard was that it often causes a lot of really nasty problems when there's an intermediary, like for example, a virus scanner in there, and they do a lot of buffering and weird stuff, and it's really hard to debug those problems. I'm not saying that that's a deal killer. I'm just noting it.
This is true. What I don't know is if something is intercepting your TCP connection like that, I can imagine that would be the case whatever TCP connection you had held open. So basically this whole method is probably not going to work for you regardless of...
Well, what it is that something's intercepting and it assumes the semantics of HTTP is at a response granularity, and that's not using response granularity. It's using something much finer.
So one option is that we just add a HTTP header you can set, which says do this in long polling mode instead. So basically close the connection every time you send a push. Other than that, it's identical. We have actually implemented this at Fastmail because for IE8 and 9, you couldn't do, because they were doing buffering things, similar things. So it used it as long polling instead. So the client could detect something's not working here. It doesn't get the pings through. As I said, it's sending pings every 5 minutes, so it knows if it's connected. And instead goes, fine, I'll just switch to long polling mode. It's a trivial change. You don't have to change your code pretty much at all. So that's one potential solution to that.
Okay.
Any other comments on event source from people?
Okay, Jeff Sipek again. I don't really have an opinion either way, but I would be a little worried on in some server setups of just you having way too many persistent TCP connections going to the server, which I guess is it's basically what you get with IMAP. So
yeah, I was going to say there's going to be fewer than with IMAP.
Yeah,
probably. If you were idling on, is that right, Bron? If you're idling on multiple folders, you would have to have multiple connections for each one. Yes, whereas this would have a single connection for the whole of your mail store. So,
and if you use HTTP2, then that's not going to be a concern. So.
Yes, also true. Okay, so I think actually this is probably a reasonable solution for that side of the push, which is good. I think we should probably maybe look at adding the option of setting of a header in the spec to switch into long polling mode, which I think is a good fallback position for when you have intermediaries getting in the way, as Mark noted. It's normally because of buffering issues, and if you close the connection, they flush the buffer. But that's a very trivial change, and I think that will be okay. So the other mechanism is the one that goes via a callback URL. I think Martin's main objection here was when I said it meets 8030, he was like, yes, but actually 8030 is not the current state of the art. If you want to use it with web push, for example, you're going to need all this extra encryption happening on the push, which is in a draft RFC, which is not actually final yet. So the question is, do we want to require that? Do we want to have support for that, but make it optional so that if your client and push server doesn't want to use that, it doesn't have to? Let's start with those.
So Mark again. So web push, at least with a browser, the push server is going to be something that is probably not under the control of the end user or the mail server, or whatever, the JMAP server. It's going to be a third party, so you probably are going to need to encrypt it. That's why that's so integrated into that architecture.
Yeah, what's actually pushed, we've taken a lot of care to make sure doesn't actually include really sensitive information on the whole. Arguably, there's some things you can glean from it, but most of those things you could glean from just knowing a push was sent from the server to this client, which you can't hide by encryption because you're still pushing the data. So that's the question of how much actual value you're getting from that. However, if you're going to, well, yes, I know, you can always, if you're going to make it work with web push directly, then obviously you're going to need this encryption because it won't work without that.
If you have a browser client.
If you want a browser client, yes, sorry, as well as I meant. So I guess the issues there are basically, at the moment we're referencing something that's not reached RFC status, or do we reference the W3C one? I don't actually know what you would normally do here.
Just
for the encryption bit.
Just reference the draft.
The draft, yeah. Because I think the web push W3C one actually references the draft as well.
Right. So just from a mechanical standpoint, it'll get eventually done. The worst possible situation will be, well, not the worst possible, but the common situation will be if they take longer than you do, then you'll sit in the RFC editor queue and wait for the dependency. You won't get your final RFC published, but everything else will be done, and you can still implement.
I guess the other main question is just simply if you do control the push server and the UA and you don't want to do that, should it be optional in some respect, because you're increasing the complexity for the client to have to implement this? But chances are that's not going to get through.
Well, no, it's more deployment complexity, because if you have to support both browser and non-browser clients, then you've got two different systems. And
well, this will support browser and non-browser clients either way. It's just, do the non-browser clients also have to implement the same encryption that the browser does, is why I'm asking, really. I guess any opinions on that? Do we just mandate the encryption so it's just, at least then it's the same with everyone, but does make it more complicated to implement, potentially?
I guess the interesting question would be for a non-browser client on a operating system that's going to benefit from that approach. Is it going to be available as web push or something else? And I'm thinking about like an iOS native client, for example.
Yes.
And you're probably just going to be using Apple's push mechanisms anyway.
So the iOS native client, Neil could probably comment more if he wants to online. I'm presuming what would happen is, yes, your JMAP server would make the post to Apple's server, which would then route it via APNS back to their mail client. So there's a question of, yes, how much are you? It could still be encrypted. You could still use exactly the same encryption mechanism to go all the way around, and the client decrypts it again. It's just, does it need to? And if not, I don't know.
So, just Mark again. Sorry, Dave. Dave's just very patiently sitting there, waiting for little dots to eat. I personally, not knowing, just very new to this, but it seems like maybe this is kind of like authentication in the previous discussion, where this is a point where you need flexibility. If it's a browser client, web push is available, great, use web push. If you're a native client on iOS, then use a different.
Oh yeah, so it's perhaps I've not been clear trying to explain them. It's not necessarily using web push. No, it provides the application server bit that you need to be able to use web push, or to be able to use proprietary mechanism X that you need to get it to your device. So it's basically whether because the web push requires the encryption, whether you require the encryption for people that are not using web push. That's the question. Yes.
Okay, Dave.
So the process point that I want to comment on is a suggestion to consider incorporating something that's being developed in a parallel working group. Suffers more than just the possible queue latency that was cited. It just generally means that you're leaving your fate to another group that may or may not produce something useful. On the average, that's not such a good idea. This topic is another one that's in a space that has no clean solution unless you completely constrain the environment. As soon as somebody says, you could use web push, or you could use a proprietary, or you could, then what you're again saying is non-interoperability. It means that the client and the server have to be implemented in a highly cohesive fashion, which is exactly not what these sorts of protocols are supposed to require.
No, the push.
Go ahead.
Dave.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say there's two servers involved. That's the thing. There's a push server and the application server, which is the JMAP server. And your push server, yes, is heavily tied to your client in terms of implementation. And that's a kind of necessary thing for this to work at all, because there are different push mechanisms you have to use if you're on different platforms, which will require different push servers. But the application server is the same for all of these situations. And I don't see any interoperability issues with that from what we've been suggesting.
I think I understand what you just said. My suspicion is that when it gets down to actually having random clients working with random servers, that what you said will turn out not to be true in terms of the push server. But I mostly wanted to raise a flag about fate sharing here. I think this, like the authentication, is another topic that needs a well-defined interface and to defer the solution to take it out of critical path.
Lexi?
Just talking about web push working group in particular, I think most of their work is done and they're about to close. There are like few remaining documents going through ISG review. So I suspect they will be done way before ours. So referencing their specs shouldn't be particularly problematic. But I mean.
Okay, so I think then it seems, actually, well, Chris, you speak now.
Yes. So on the interoperability point with this, you've got a three-party problem. So there's interoperability between the client and the server, the JMAP client and the JMAP server. That's the key thing there is you have to have a client identifier, and the client and then the client will get something out of band, and the client has to know how to use what it gets out of band with the JMAP server, and we've defined both those pieces. So that's the key interoperability thing. And then the client on iOS will use the iOS mechanism, the client on Android will use the Android mechanism, and the people operating the JMAP server can hook it up to the right mechanism based on the client. So I think you do get interoperability with this.
Yeah, I think you do too. And it's actually very simple what the JMAP server does. It is literally just making a post request to a URL the client gives it. Now, how the client gets that URL is up to the client, depending on the mechanism it's using for the push, what push server it's using, and that kind of thing. But we can't and should not define anything for that, because that entirely depends on where the client is, whether it's on an iOS or Apple, or in a browser or Android or whatever.
Okay, we have a comment from Sean Leonard.
Yep.
Not too familiar with this space, but what if this JMAP spec defines a uniform message type, message/JMAP push notification or application/JMAP push notification that is packaged and encrypted according to the relevant push mechanism. Then the web push/iOS push modules pass that to the JMAP handler to deal with it.
Okay. I think the actual push situation is hang on, I'm getting a bit, how do I explain this? I don't think this is as complicated perhaps as it's kind of appearing, because there's a you need to look at the actual specs that are involved, including the JMAP one. What we've tried to do is make it very simple. Essentially, what it boils down to is the client gives the JMAP server a URL. When something changes, the server posts to that URL. And the way it posts is compatible with RFC 8030 if you want to use web push. But other than that, you can forget about web push and just, I have a server, I get that information, and I have to get that to the client somehow, and you can do that however you like. So it's very easy. The compatibility, as was mentioned earlier, is actually quite easy. It's just, how do I handle that data when I get it, and how do I and if I run a push server, it's up to you that to get the push to the client. So I think, yeah, really the only thing is, yes, whether you have to encrypt it so that it can definitely be compatible with web push. So if the spec's almost done, that might be the best way forward, and you can always decrypt it on other platforms too. Okay. Fine. So I will finish amending the current pull request proposal on this, and then perhaps people can review this further on the list when they have had a look through the actual proposal, and if we have any further queries, we'll go from there. Okay, let's move on. Final can of worms, the transport mechanism. So it's been an area of a bit of debate on the mailing list. The use of HTTP as a tunnel mechanism, essentially, versus resources for every object in JMAP, and the reasons why. And there's already been quite a lot of posted stuff on the list about why we chose to do what we did, and why we think it's the right solution, and why we think it makes sense in this space. But if we just go to the next slide, I think I have Mark's document on using HTTP. Sorry, current draft on recommendations using HTTP of why you might not want to just tunnel. And then I just want to mention briefly why I think in this case it actually does make sense. So in terms of caching, because this is all kind of data behind a log and it's all sensitive data, it's all going to definitely be over HTTPS. You're mainly connecting, well, you're going to be connecting directly to the JMAP server. You're not going to go through large numbers of caches. The caching is also different in that what you're likely to have is a large set of structured data, and the server can tell you which ones to invalidate specifically, which is much more efficient for this case. Whereas generally, they're not all independent resources which each have their own independent validation tag, which is how HTTP model stuff, and makes a lot more sense for if you have for general web stuff. It makes less sense for this. I'm sure he does. We'll get. No, we actually have until 3:30 if we need to, because it's. Yeah, but there's nothing else in here for now.
The agenda said 3 what?
3 p.m.
No, we end at 3:30.
Okay.
So we have time.
Okay, so authentication we've already talked about. I don't think is particularly different in this case. It's applicable either way. Automatic redirection, again, not. I don't see huge wins for us in this situation. Your mail is generally co-located. Partial content doesn't make sense for like a partial bit of a JSON response. It makes sense for your binary data, and the binary upload and download is all very standard HTTP, and you can of course use range requests and everything else with that in JMAP 2. This is just for the API requests that's tunneled. Versioning extensions we've spoken about. I think we need JMAP needs its own mechanism to be a good fit for that, and the ability to interact with the application using a web browser. We can certainly build a full JMAP client in a web browser. I guess you can't just stick in. You have to send post requests to get the data. So in that respect, it's slightly more difficult. But on the other hand, you can just use curl because it's tunneling over HTTP, and that's quite nice. So firstly, Mark, do you want to say anything about those? And yeah.
So Mark Nottingham again. It keeps on moving. I look at, and I've just started looking at your stuff, and I apologize for that. So, this is just initial impression. I think that, the intent that I have, and again, it hasn't been adopted by anybody yet. My intent in BCP 56, this is not to tell, people you can't do that, or to have some book of holy law of, how thou shalt use HTTP, because that just doesn't work. It's just more to make sure that people make informed decisions when they do use HTTP. There is some stuff in the draft that I'll probably file some issues on and ask for changes, but it's mostly editorial level stuff of how you document how you use HTTP, and I don't think it hopefully won't be terribly controversial. But the tunneling, the batching multiple requests over as I understand it, you're doing that because you're not just batching for performance, you're batching because they're semantically dependent.
Yes,
Right.
there's various reasons. And the next slide is then us. I'll get to that. Is actually why we think it's beneficial to tunnel. This is kind of going the
Sure.
other reasons.
Sure. I mean, you talk about caching. I mean, if you have a browser client, then the browser cache is kind of an obvious win. And I can imagine certainly on the server side, there can be some cases where some intermediary caches might be more useful than you would think. And again, it's not that you have to do that. It's just it's leaving the door open for as many different kinds of implementations as possible is sometimes a really good thing. Especially when you have things like CDNs and stuff out there.
I think your mail is unlikely to be on a CDN. But
Sorry?
Your mail is unlikely to be on a CDN, although it certainly
you
can
might
be
be
more
surprised. It's a weird world out there.
Yes. That's
So my high level feedback, and maybe I'm jumping ahead, and I apologize. My high level feedback is, I'll file a couple little issues, and we can talk about that. But if you really want to do this and it's eyes open, then I'm not going to stand in the road and say no, because I don't think that's appropriate to do. I'm a little surprised that this group got chartered to put everything across 443 without more kerfuffle. I'm interested to see what the ops people are going to say about that. But I personally think that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons so over 443 is
sure
is there's is historically we've had issues. Again, this is a support thing that comes up a lot of various ports being blocked in various situations, and it just makes life so much easier for support if
it's just that. Well, welcome to the IETF.
Well, yes. Thank you, Mark. Yes.
Regarding the batching, I guess for me, my takeaway here is that I think it's possible in a fairly simple way to design some HTTP extensions that would allow you to express those dependencies between requests and get what you want, and to have one URI per request.
If we go to the next slide, I'll talk a bit more about.
Okay.
This.
That's what I. Yes, definitely.
Conversation.
He Alexei asked if such an extension would be generally beneficial outside of JMAP, and I said yes. And I think that's for me that we're constantly looking for ways we can improve HTTP so it serves a broader audience, and that's what to me that's our job.
Yes, although just saying a step back, I think there is still benefit to having something that works over HTTP 1.1, even if there are benefits like. If you're not getting major benefits from HTTP 2, that gives you so much easier implementation in many situations. There's many more platforms that support it, et cetera, for version 1.1. But that's not really what I want to go through here. This is more why we think this using tunneling works well. So yes, the back reference is one of the things, is that you can create one object and then refer to it in another object in the same call. And importantly, the server does not have to hold any state between the different requests. You don't have to know how long should I hold this state in case I get the following request, but I don't know if I'll ever get it, that kind of thing. You've either got all your references or you don't. Similarly, a single method call can do multiple operations on the same data type. So you could have something that renames A to B and something that renames B to A, and know that you're going to get consistent results. If you were doing this with multiple things, you would have to have intermediaries, and you don't know if something's going to fail in between because it may never get to the server. Even if you say these are dependent, you may not. The server may never get the later one for whatever reason. It's very simple to implement clients on a platform, as we were saying. Library support's easy. Debugging is really easy compared to multiple concurrent requests and trying to work out what actually happened in terms of how they were received. Atomic fetch and multiple resources at the same server state. If I ask for 3 different messages in a single method request, a single method call is guaranteed to be the same state within it. And so I will get back consistent state for those 3 messages. We can't guarantee atomic state even between method calls and a single API request, which is a single HTTP thing. We don't guarantee atomic, but within a single method you do.
Sorry, is your use case there specifically fetching, for example, 3 different messages, or are you just?
So that was probably a poor example. Okay. It was more just that within a single method you can
3 things, 3 mailboxes or whatever.
Yeah, I want the message count on all my mailboxes.
Right.
Is something that you get in the total count of all the messages on the server without an intermediate state while you're moving messages.
Yes. We think it's probably easier for server to implement rate limiting, although, and you certainly don't get the situation where, again, you have dependent stuff and it gets rate limited halfway through. And so, again, you end up with a slightly odd state of something that is half done. And the other main thing we think is very important for performance is round trip times. Any high latency environments, particularly mobile, and particularly if you're in Australia and say connected to New York, every round trip makes a big difference. And even the best HTTP2 suggestions we've seen, most complex suggestions, still use more round trips than we do with this current proposal. So kind of the summary is that, yes, we think for this situation, what we're doing, using HTTP as a tunnel makes a lot of sense. We get benefits from using HTTP rather than random other TCP protocol. But we also get a lot of benefits from batching stuff up in like as a tunnel rather than necessarily using everything as a separate resource. That's the summary.
So ordering, I think, would be pretty easy for us to provide to you. Making it atomic is a lot more interesting.
Back references also are pretty interesting.
Well, yeah, there are ways you could do that. You mentioned caching before. We actually have a number of different invalidation extensions which might be interesting for you. But again, you'd have to buy into the whole package, not just part of it. So,
this takes us to one interesting thing is we want this to be usable by developers who maybe don't have much skill.
Sure.
And so certainly Martin's suggestions last night of ways that you could do this turned out to be a lot of work for a very highly skilled developer rather than something that any web monkey can slap together a quick little tool that shows them some information from their email.
Yeah.
That's an interesting challenge. We don't want people to have a PhD in email to use this or a PhD in HTTP.
It scared me with having web people write my email handling software. That really scared me.
That's fine. You're using Fastmail, it'll be good. But other people might want to be able to get email. But I think more general point is like even things like, so a lot of these suggestions use some of the more complex bits of HTTP2. Most of those capabilities are not exposed, for example, directly in the browser. In the XHR objects, you can't interact with a lot of
sure.
Some of the XHR. So you wouldn't even be able to do this in some of the environments we want this to be able to operate in.
Sure.
I said, I think a lot of this seems to be, I'm sure I can make this fit HTTP2 somehow, but it doesn't seem to give any tangible benefits over what we're doing and seem to have more downsides compared to upsides, is I think our opinion on this anyway.
And that's an entirely reasonable position to have, I think. For me, I guess what I would love to be able to do is to continue the conversation so we understand your requirements more and feed those into some thinking and perhaps some extension development. And it might be that our timeline for those extensions exceed what you need and you won't be able to use them, but it'd be great to have your input and feedback just so we understand. And it might be that if we can come up with some proposals that are more modest to make it a little more well aligned with HTTPs as commonly used, that would be good to talk about too. But I don't think, I totally understand why you've done what you've done. And those are real shortcomings, and that's very reasonable.
Yeah. We know this method works. It's been tested in various situations. There are multiple companies even running this style thing now. And so there's something to be said for a kind of a system that's been proved rather than something that's ideas that we may be able to implement in the next year or two.
No, totally. Yeah. But if we can keep those channels open, that could be
sure.
good.
Yeah.
Okay, comment from Sean. I would like to see CBOR support in JMAP core using the same data model. That is, rather than submitting and accepting application JSON, application CBOR would also be defined. Since CBOR is a superset of JSON, it should be an easy thing to add and support. Results in increased efficiency on the wire both ways. Not proposing CBOR specific data model elements at this time.
So I just want to make a quick comment. Congratulations, you now achieved IETF bingo. You've had CBOR, OAuth, HTTP, web authentication. You're across the board. Congratulations.
But no blockchain stuff yet.
Jeff.
Jeff Sipek. So one thing about the whole caching thing, and I'm not saying that REST is great. I'm not saying that what you propose is bad, but the caching. I think it would be nice to be able to have the browser itself be able to cache the bits and pieces that it gets from the server. So stupid web, like the scenario, stupid webmail JavaScript thing, right? You close the browser. It would be nice for the browser to cache the data for the JavaScript blob, so that the JavaScript blob doesn't have to explicitly cache things. Even
if you're building a good webmail these days, you'd want to do the caching yourself with IndexedDB. To be honest with you, I would say, and and you just don't have enough control over the cache invalidation. Your performance wins are not going to be enough to offset the performance losses, I think, that you get from the change in model, because it would still have to revalidate that with the server basically every time, because you can't tell the browser cache to only invalidate when you get a state string push from the server.
But email is asynchronous, so that little bit of latency during revalidation shouldn't matter that much, right?
We think latency always matters. Like, we want every action to be instant to the user as much as possible when we're designing stuff.
Right, but that's for mutating the state, which is different from loading stuff from the cache.
No, but your cache may be stale. Like, something you think was unread is now read.
Okay, so anyway, that was the client side. On the server side, as far as I know, it is fairly common for ISPs to set up their deployment in multiple tiers, where the hosts that actually store the emails do not actually have internet access. And there are two levels of proxies going in. The SSL session, the TLS sessions are terminated at the border, and inside the data center, it's all clear text, which presents itself to all sorts of wonderful caching, which you would get for free by just using basically reverse proxies with HTTP. With the list of JMAP methods, you don't get that. Sure, you get it for the blobs, but I guess I'm just looking at this and going, so you want what it is that you're proposing is an email fetching on top of an RPC mechanism using JSON, using HTTP, using TLS. And I'm just thinking, do we need another RPC mechanism?
Well, yes.
So, anyway, that's
okay.
Keith Moore, in response to the commenter who suggested using CBOR as an alternative, I would like to strongly recommend that exactly one presentation layer be pushed or be part of this protocol. I don't think there's a real unfortunate tendency in IETF and elsewhere, I think, to sort of support every flavor, and that's not a good thing for either interoperability or for keeping things from becoming for semantic drift between the different representations of things, which always seems to happen. So, and also, I don't think there's enough efficiency benefit of CBOR for this use case to recommend it.
Mark again, +1 to that. I don't want this to be taken as a suggestion, so I'm not sure I'm okay with it. But has there been any discussion about offering the resources both using the post tunnel as well as using GETS?
As well as using what, sorry?
As using GETS.
Oh, you mean like just standard GET?
Give it a URI.
Give it a URI.
Yeah.
Yes, you could map pretty easily the basic GET stuff and even the set, the like JMAP itself is really very restful. It just doesn't use HTTP verbs for it. Therefore, you could map everything onto HTTP verbs, and you'd end up with a lot of connections and.
Well, no, with H2.
True. Yeah.
When you don't need it to be atomic and you don't need it to be ordered.
Yes, when you don't need that stuff, then yes, you could get lots.
I don't know if it's a good idea or not, but it's maybe something to talk about.
Yeah, it's something we're not sure. Like, you could define a kind of mapping on top of here's a way if you want to use that.
Right.
You can
or an optional extension or whatever.
Like that. Yeah.
Because you can even imagine that being translated at some layer, and and has there been any discussion of using WebSockets instead of HTTP?
Yes. I think you trivially could. And again, it's kind of a bit like the CBOR thing. If we didn't want to define two different mechanisms originally, or you're saying instead of HTTP?
I meant to say instead of, yes.
Right. Okay. It's certainly an option. I think when we considered it, there's some of the nice things about HTTP is just its complete ubiquity means it has better support on certain platforms. So like talking to Apple and iOS developers, they have a lot of stuff built into the operating system to coalesce HTTP requests to be more efficient with the battery usage.
Sure.
Whereas WebSockets, I don't
TCP,
believe,
yeah.
they have that, and again, you've got connections hold open. So
it
was reasons like that yes, I think WebSockets is a really attractive way of tunneling this as well, and you can really be easy to do that. But it makes more sense to have HTTP as the base. But
it's pragmatic.
Yeah, basically. I'm quite interested in trying putting it over WebSockets myself. I think, Alexei, you were talking about this as well. Yeah, especially now we have gzip or deflate at least both ways on at least most modern browsers.
Neil on Meet Echo, you're up.
Hey, it's Neil. I actually had just the same exact comment. I was wondering if we had explored kind of a duality where we can continue to expose as HTTP resources, in everything in a very restful manner, but then also provide for the cases where multiple operations do need to be batched to avoid those extra round trips that do really impact client performance. Over IMAP, I know there are some APIs that offer this kind of dual mode of operation. For example, the Google Drive REST API offers a batch endpoint where you can post a multi-part mixed content type request to a batch API endpoint, but all the other, and everything else can still go over regular HTTP. Have we considered that more thoroughly? And if not, I'd love to see some more discussion about that.
I think it's something we've talked about a little bit, but not considered perhaps deeply a proposal. I think what we would be interesting to see there would be a mapping, because what you don't want is to have to define every time the second different way of doing it. But if you could come up with a generic mapping of saying this is an alternative where you can just use an HTTP resource, this is how you get its URI for this component, then I guess the main question would be would you mandate to server support both methods, or again, it's introducing options into
an easy way to deal with that, because we already have URI templates for blob IDs. You could have the same thing if you provide a URI template that could be used with a object name and an object ID to fetch.
There are ways we can do this. I think the bigger question is, as I said, whether having to support two different mechanisms if you want to be compliant, or do you make one optional, and that always leads to extra complexity and difficulties in terms of interoperability, potentially.
Chris Newman, I'd actually bounce a question back at Neil on this: is can you articulate a clear benefit of having some clear benefits that we get in email clients from having the RESTful model?
I think that from a strictly functional perspective, I agree with most of the content that's already been discussed, that there isn't actually a huge functional benefit. I think from a stylistic perspective, it'll be more approachable to developers for the first time if everything is a little bit more HTTP-like. I also am not convinced that the tunneling is necessarily going to provide a lot of performance benefits in the vast majority of scenarios. I know that one scenario that was cited was kind of moving a message to a new mailbox, and that being 3 commands instead of just 2, and that's legitimate. I think in common operation though, the example I can think of from a client author's point of view is just launching the app and wanting to update the list of messages, and over IMAP that's going to be at least 4 round trips for most clients, and over JMAP, even if it was more RESTful, I think that could be already condensed down to 1. So you get a huge portion of the round trip time reduction without necessarily adding this mental model complexity of tunneling. But no, I don't actually think there's any hard functional benefits that I can think of to being RESTful other than just the stylistic conformance.
Okay. I think one of the issues there is when you're, this is where you'd probably have to have HTTP2 and HTTP2 push to make this really work, because so in your scenario, if I open up my app and I want to get updates, in JMAP there's a single method call get message list updates, which you'd say I'm getting updates on my inbox, say here's my last state, and it would return you here's you've added messages at position 0 and 1, and this is their IDs. Now in JMAP you'd also pass a flag to the call to say, actually I want to fetch those messages as well at the same time, and here's the properties I want on those, and so you make a single request, you get a single thing back. So with HTTP, each of those messages has to be a different resource, presumably, if we're going to make this map cleanly. So you'd have to have HTTP2 push to be able to presume that you wanted to fetch those resources as well and return those responses, when what you were really fetching initially with the URL was just the get me updates to the list, what are the new IDs? Because otherwise you'd have to wait for the IDs to come back and then make the fetch to those IDs, so then you're back to at least 2 round trips again with HTTP. But if you had push from HTTP2, then you could potentially presume the client wanted those, or have the client able to indicate that and return those responses as well. So I think it's doable. I think the biggest reason to have a way of doing this is, as Neil was saying, it's more approachable to developers and may make it easier for new people to adopt. I think the current version is better on the whole from a technical point of view. It's likely to result in better network usage. And I think maybe we should look into if there's a mapping that we can create and servers can provide both, and whether then, as I said, the question is just kind of, is that possible to do? Probably. If so, how complex is that to implement, and should servers be made to implement both, or is that an optional thing, and what issues arise from that? Any further comments on this?
Okay.
Puzzled faces, but no further comments. So we can have further stuff on the list when people have thought about it more, perhaps.
So the last thing on the agenda is going over GitHub tickets.
Yeah. Well, we've only got 10 minutes, but luckily there's not too much new interesting things I thought we'd bring up. Feel free to file more tickets if you see issues, or bigger issues, obviously discuss on the main list. But just a few interesting things. Alexi raised this ticket of question of when you get foo update, so what this is, if you've not seen JMAP before, is I have a type foo, and it's saying, since my last state, give me the IDs of things that have changed within this type. So at the moment, it returns something that says, these have been changed, which means either created or updated, modified, and these IDs have been destroyed. Obviously, the destroyed ones, the client never needs to fetch, so it's helpful to have those separate. At the moment, created and updated all are together. You just get a single set of IDs that are changed. The main reason for this is it's easier for the server because it doesn't have to know when you saw it to know whether it's been created or updated. And for the client, it shouldn't make much difference because if it's got it, it needs to refresh it. If it doesn't have it, it doesn't really matter whether it was updated or created. Alexei.
Okay. If I remember correctly, I was just comparing different getFoo methods for different objects, and for some of them you separated them, and for some of them you haven't.
It's consistent. You're comparing getting changes on an object to getting changes on a query, which is like get message list, which is a query on the message type, and that's where it tells you this has been added to your query and this is the index you insert it at, and this is removed. So they are consistent. It's just the difference between
maybe in this case
to a query and updates to a data type.
A bit more text explaining why you've done it like this would be useful.
Sure. Okay. And just I think we've got one more if we flip to the next slide. This is interesting issue. So what to do if you try to destroy a mailbox that currently has messages in it? So at the moment, the spec says you just can't do it. It's an error. Disallows it. Upside, deleting more data requires more effort. Downside, you obviously have to actually explicitly remove each message from the mailbox if you want to do it. The current thing fits well with the general JMAP philosophy that changes are explicit on the whole. Like if the client didn't request the change, something doesn't happen generally as a side effect, whereas this is kind of a side effect, and that model generally makes it easier to stay in sync efficiently. So the other alternatives here, though, are it just removes it automatically from the mailboxes. That's right. The other issue with this is, so JMAP supports the possibility of multiple mailboxes for a message, if your server can support that. So what happens if you only have that mailbox left in the message? That actually then deletes the message rather than just leaving it in one of the other mailboxes. One of the earlier drafts we had with JMAP moved it to the inbox if it was the last one, but that's even weirder. Yeah, we definitely don't want that. So I guess just general opinions on what you should do here, whether it should be an error, should be allowed, what it should do, and whether kind of slightly take a step back, should it be possible to have a message with 0 mailboxes, but that's still in the system, that's not deleted, which kind of is no. I mean, that makes IMAP support harder, compatibility harder. It's kind of closer to the Gmail model in some ways. But I guess, yes, any comments on what should happen in this case, whether you should be allowed to destroy mailboxes that have messages in them, and what should happen then?
I suppose I'm a bit struggling with use case where why would you want to delete a mailbox without deleting messages? What's like if you're treating how do you explain the difference to the user, and is this one operation more common than the other one?
Just as not these guys, this is Barry. I see it as maybe you warn the user that there are messages in the mailbox. Do you really want to delete it? But it is convenient sometimes. I have messages that I've accumulated for a particular purpose. I don't need them anymore. I delete the whole batch in one thing. I don't need to do transactions to delete every message, and I don't want to.
Well, that's exactly it. If you want to ask,
It's a user interface, right? Thank you. Go to the mic. It's a user interface issue whether you want to warn the user that there are messages here
that's
too.
Which one is likely to be more common? Well, anyway, actually, you can ask the user without checking whether it has any messages in it. Do you have to check?
I think it's more, if you're going to warn the user, it's more useful to check. The user says, delete this mailbox. You say, oh, it's empty. Yeah, no problem. Or, hey, this mailbox has messages in it. Do you really want to delete it with all its messages? But that's a user interface question, and I'm not going to try to design a user interface. I just find as a user that it's a useful function to be able to say, okay, I'm done with that stuff, get rid of it.
Chris Newman, I'll prefix this by, I'll be happy with whatever we do here, but I think there is a, I'm afraid the better option is the most is a more complex one, and the one I lean towards is there's a delete mailbox method with an optional argument that says okay to delete if it has messages, and I'm sorry, I know that's more complicated, but why I would suggest this is the knowledge that you're removing the mailbox and the messages at the same time is useful knowledge for server management.
I don't think you need a separate argument in that, presumably you have fetched the mailbox object, which is very small, and clients would generally have fetched all the mailbox objects. It has a count of how many messages are in it. So you know if it has messages or not. And you can already use, we have an if in state option with set stuff, which basically says only apply this command if the state on the server is currently the same as in my client. Like if something may have changed in between, like you may have appended a message to this, abort the operation. So that guarantees then that it had no messages, and you told the server it must be in the same state for you to delete this. So I don't actually think we need a separate custom command in order to be able to implement this when there's a standard like this that's applicable throughout all of JMAP. So I think I'm reasonably happy to change it to just it removes the mailbox from the messages, which if it's the last mailbox means it deletes the message.
Yeah, I lean that way because where it's interesting is servers generally have to have some mechanism to deal with user requests where they accidentally deleted something, and two separate operations of moving the messages to the trash and then deleting the folder. That creates a different recovery model from delete the messages in the folder at the same time. Then you can do a shortcut on recovery if the folder reappears with all the messages in it. So it's a server management type.
Yeah, the interesting philosophical question here is: are you deleting an mbox from a directory on the server by unlinking a file, or do you have a foreign constraint between messages in a database and mailboxes in a database, and you can't delete the mailbox while mailbox ID is being referenced from something in another table, which is very much an SQL style constraint. You say foreign key constraint requires this ID to be present, and then you can't delete the mailbox while there's still something that refers to it. So that's the decision we're making here, is which philosophy do we have for mailbox message membership?
Well, I think the one on the SQL side, you're arguing that the delete with messages is a more complicated thing to implement. But I'm not concerned about the complexity of the server. I'm less concerned about the server vendor's complexity. More concerned about preserving semantics.
So the other side of that as a client is if you delete a mailbox with 1 million messages in it and you say get message updates, you're going to get 1 million messages that have had their sequence number bumped because their
you'd get an error of cannot calculate max changes. You'd be able to page through all the changes, but it would take you forever to do it.
Yeah,
probably.
But it is a side effect. All these messages are having their state affected by the fact that the mailbox has gone away.
In that. But on the other hand, the other option is the client has to make that many requests in the first place to actually do it. So either way, if you've got 1 million messages, you're going to have some back and forth kind of required, I guess. Okay. I'll think about that a bit more and maybe post something on the GitHub ticket, but sounds like probably we'll change that to remove the messages and let you do it rather than erroring. Okay, very quickly. Oh yes, this is simply, so earlier we saw the data type of the keywords. We saw it mapped from the keyword name to true. There's a question about why that rather than a list, and because it makes it easier to patch is basically the answer. Currently, mailbox IDs is just a list, so really they need to be aligned, I think, as a data format, because they're both kind of the same thing. It's a list, it's a set of metadata things, and you can add and remove them, and there's no ordering, and you want to be able to patch it rather than have to replace the whole set at once. So it's more just yes. Does that make sense to people? Any comments on the use of a set kind of thing mapping to true from a name. Lots of non-committal faces. Fine. Okay, well, we're out of time, so I think we can bring it up on the list if we have any other ideas about that. I'll hand that back to Bron.
So the last slide here was other business, other GitHub tickets of interest. We don't have time to look at them now, but we should go through that and discuss on the list all the tickets that are currently open. So I will open a thread for each ticket that looks like it has some discussion worth doing on the list so that we can deal with it there. Suggestion of doing a hackathon on JMAP in Singapore. If it looks like we're going to be ready for that closer to the date, then I'll request a hackathon so we can start playing with interoperability on the things that we've agreed on at least.
I'd like to shortcut that and say there will be a hackathon project in Singapore. Start planning for it.
Yeah.
And Bron, are you willing to be the champion for the project?
Yes.
So we'll put you into the wiki on that.
Cool. Planning to have a dinner tonight at an Indian restaurant, which was up on my screen but didn't pop up to the other thing there, but I'll send through again an email to the list. Do you have a rough idea of how many people would be available / interested for dinner tonight? 7 o'clock after. All right, it's 2, 4. Cool. So about 10 to 12 probably. I will call them up and reserve a table.
Just one other thing on the hackathon. Does anyone need an explanation of what the hackathon is or when it is, or do you all know? Okay, the IETF hackathon started a while ago, and they're a thing on Saturday and Sunday before the IETF meeting. So plan your travels so you arrive sometime Friday, have a little recovery, and pop into the hackathon. It goes from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. on Saturday. You don't have to be there the whole time. And from 9 a.m. to about 4 p.m. on Sunday. And you just sit there for a day and a half working out some project that you're working on. And in this case, it will be implementing testing, interoperability testing, whatever it is for JMAP.
Yeah, I've got a specific item there for testing as well. We have the start of a test framework for JMAP, and that's one of the goals for the next little while, is to have some fast-mail people work on fleshing that out so that we can actually test other server implementations, at least for compliance. Client testing is always a little bit trickier because there's all the user interface side of things. With the server, you can more check that it's complying with what you're expecting. I'll put a note for calendar contact future extensions. There's work underway in CalConnect defining objects for calendars and objects for contacts that would be compatible with JMAP. And there's already some rough drafts on JMAP.io for how they would look as JMAP style objects and the relationships between them. We're already using something very similar on Fastmail for our calendars and contacts, and the JMAP proxy already proxies them to CalDAV and CardDAV, and looks quite nice. So we didn't do that now because there's enough material without it, but they would be natural extensions to JMAP fairly early in the piece.
And we are now 2 minutes into the break, so let's take the break. This break has no food. The break in a couple of hours does. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming to Barcelona.
Yes.